Want to welcome everybody to the webinar. We've got a full program for you and lots of value, so we hope that you get lots of takeaways from it. This is the outcome, one of the outcomes of a project that Duncan Maclennan has been leading with my assistants on multi-level governance in housing and infrastructure. We've done some comparative work across multiple countries and a lot of focus on Canada, and some of you may have participated. And so we're very grateful for your support, and we're very much looking forward to the conversation and reflection on what we've done. I just want to acknowledge that we're based at McMaster University. CHEC is based at McMaster University, and we're on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Abenishaba nations, and our relationship is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which allows us to share in the stewardship of this territory and these lands. And it's a responsibility that we certainly take seriously. And housing, of course, being a very grounded and territorial topic, it's incredibly important that we all take good care of our home in shared stewardship and reconciliation. So thank you very much for that. So next, I'm going to pass it on to our chair today. We're very fortunate to have Chris Murray. And Chris, some of you may know, is the former city manager in both Hamilton and Toronto. And he now sits on the board of MPAC and works with Deloitte. And we're very, very fortunate to have Chris guiding us in this and providing some reflections as well. So Chris, I will hand it over to you to kick things off.
So thanks so much, Jim, and it is a real pleasure and honor to be here. I understand we have people literally attending from around the world. And so with that, we're going to spend the next hour and a half, I'm sure, learning things that maybe we hadn't completely understood before, with some direction going forward. So our guests today have a variety of backgrounds that align with the topic that we're here to talk about. But in general, as I understand from the paper that Duncan produced and the 20-minute video, and I must say, Duncan, I understood every word you said. I've been to Scotland a couple of times now, so I'm getting more acclimatized. So what I gathered in a sentence from everything that you had said was that maybe the problem we're facing is that our government structures aren't set up to deal with the systemic nature of the housing problem. And so, of course, what we're going to have happen over the next short while, first Duncan will speak briefly about the major findings. And then we have academic experts, Alexandra Flynn and Neil Bradford, to comment on the findings from their perspectives. I'll introduce them momentarily. We will then talk with the city practitioner panel and understand how do these findings reflect their experience. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity to hear from all of you what your questions are, and we will field them accordingly when those questions come up. So with that, then maybe we should just get started. And I think many of you know Duncan, but Duncan Maclennan is a professor of urban economics, University of Glasgow, specializing in applied economics, focused on housing systems, cities, neighborhoods, and infrastructure. Duncan's been doing this work for a few decades, and we hope that he'll continue to do so and forget this idea of retirement. So with that, Duncan, I'll turn it over to you, and for the next 5 minutes, you will give a synopsis of what your work has been in the last short while. Duncan?
Thanks very much, Chris. I think if it's a few more decades, I'll be the longest lived Glaswegian there ever has been, but maybe for a wee while. So I think that in the first part of the paper that I distributed, I set out our case in a sense about why the old mantra that's kind of driven much thinking about housing and to some extent infrastructure policy in Canada, namely that housing is primarily a social issue. It's primarily for the responsibility of provinces to deal with it, without in any way detracting from the important role of provinces going forward. I was making the case that I think that mantra is dead. local housing outcomes are always local. They're always grounded. You put bricks and mortar in the ground someplace, so it's always local by its very nature. But on the other hand, what happens in the housing system is driven both by market influences and policy influences that come from all levels and spatial scales or orders of government, whether they be global, national, federal, provincial, or municipality. In other words, I think the appropriate mantra going forward is this is for all of us, it's not just one level, and that the impacts are increasingly important in terms of economic change, including productivity and growth, and also environmental outcomes. We can't deal with these major missions of orders of government without actually getting to grips with the housing system and the outcomes that it drives. I think that every government in Canada at every level recognises that we're now in a polycrisis that, despite the national housing strategy, is getting worse and is actually spreading. So this is a time for rethinking about how we do this. And the first part of the paper is really about making a case for the kind of systems approach, the fact that power and authority and resources to deal with this are distributed across all kind of orders in different ways means it's an inherent subject for, if you like, of collaborative action to actually deal with the issues. The project primarily looked at collaborative action, dealing with city issues and also rural regional issues across a subset of the OECD countries. And in particular, we homed in on city deals, and I'll say briefly why. And that took us to looking at, in particular, UK, Australia, Netherlands, and Finland, because they've had the most active approaches in this regard. And they actually, although they've got the same title, they embrace a number of different approaches. And in the UK, at least, and also the Netherlands, they're used as much in rural regions or small town regions as opposed to big cities and metropolitan areas. So, and in fact, the UK renamed their city deals growth deals simply because more rural regions towards the end of the programme were actually using them. So this is for rural and small town Canada as well as the big metropolitan regions. In terms of just very quickly, what I found out, what we found out, and Jim and Julie Meow, who did our work in Australia, all contributed to this. And what is really the background to what I think is the policy approach that the Government of Canada might look at, my initiative called CHEC, and I think it is quite chic, but that's for you to decide. I think the lessons I took out of the research were the following. First of all, city deals or these strategic collaborations, they're not always about the extra money. They're about mechanisms for good practice in a whole range of areas, like setting infrastructure fees, planning, a whole raft of areas. They're about the development of effective collaboration vehicles and behaviours. They're not just about the money. And in fact, in the Dutch case, they're not primarily about the money, whereas in the UK, they actually are. And I think that it's important for the Government of Canada to consider whether or not do they have enough money on the table to start making progress to what they're doing. But will the bang for the buck be better if there's a collaborative device beginning to think and align, moving towards, obviously, questions about more resources in the longer term. Second was, these deals were always voluntary. You didn't have to do them. If you were a region or a province or a city region that didn't want to do them, you just didn't do them. But once authorities were involved and the deal was signed, they were contractual. In other words, you committed your resource, you committed to the time frame, you committed to delivering the better outcomes. And I think that's been extremely important. In the UK, it kept the national government's feet to the fire through periods when they may well have contracted the programmes that were actually really important, like infrastructure, transport, housing, skills, and so on. I think the third important thing is contracts were never made with a single municipality. It was always a group of municipalities that constituted the rural region or the metropolitan region or whatever. In other words, it gives you a new strategic geography for strategic work on systems that actually work at scales that are greater than individual local authorities. And I think that has been a really important boon to many of the entities, that they're actually dealing with functional regions rather than bits of functional regions. I think the fourth important thing was the deal was always led by local leaders. The one example, Australia, that didn't do that constituted a significant failure. In other words, the coalition of local authorities who formed the deal area were required to identify a governance structure, identify a leader, but they were in the lead. They chose the projects. They, in a sense, became responsible for the delivery. And in that context, that required a local, federal, or provincial presence, if it was a three-level systems. But it required these governments not to be heavy-handed. It required them to be collaborative and supportive and share the mission, but allow the local to dominate the choices that were actually made. That doesn't always happen. So I think it's really important. I think the fifth important thing that I would emphasize was the delivery vehicles that were created. And as academics, we don't look at this enough. To actually deliver the better roads or the better homes or the better neighbourhoods within these, the nature of these vehicles are really important because when you create them, you create new networks, you create new spaces, you create new competencies, you create new capacities. And in the big English cities, these vehicles have become more important for change than the initial investment programs actually were. In a sense, they create a networked brain, if you like, for thinking about the city region that actually brings together people, brings together organizations, brings together ideas, and really promotes change. Within that context, because you have a contractual deal, you need to have effective monitoring and evaluation. In the paper, I emphasize that good monitoring systems have been developed so that in these collaborative projects that have milestones to reach after year 2, 3, whatever, you actually know you're making progress and you're better informed than has often been the case in the past. Having said that, I think it's really important that the vehicles that are created, there's relatively light touch reporting requirements. Now, that's very difficult for national and federal governments to take that on board as an entity. But the Dutch have been really effective when they've been putting primarily vehicles in place rather than big resource elements. They don't require any significant reporting back to senior levels of government. I think that's critical. And it comes out of developing collaboration and trust between different orders of government at local levels. You can't change this system from offices in Ottawa or even from Edmonton or whatever. You've got to actually be out there. Or I wasn't picking on Crystal there, but just making the illustration. These are about local collaborations of federal entities. I think that federal involvement is a matter of spirit distributed across a country rather than a set of offices. And I don't see that when I deal with issues in Canada. the last thing, and very quickly to let others um, either correct their own conclusions or emphasize what would be useful, is they really made a strategic long run commitment. They allowed for collaborative missions to be put in place, but they also put in place the devices whereby if targets were changing, if circumstances were changing, you could remission, if you like, you would renegotiate, you would redevelop. We found some of these aspects, even in the municipal housing accelerator program, were actually quite difficult. That program skipped out provincial level. It often didn't recognize the real gaps and capacities there were at very local scales. And some of these projects ran into very different macro circumstances from when they were first envisioned. And in the deals processes that we looked at, there were ways of allowing for that and developing that and changing it. Anyway, I've had my time, so to speak, and I should stop. But these were my main reflections. I think many of these elements could be introduced into an initiative that would bring together the different elements of where federal Canada's now heading in the housing space.
There we go. Thanks so much, Duncan, for that overview. And with that, I think we'll now turn to a couple more of our guests that are here today, and I'll introduce them one by one. Next, we're going to hear from Alexandra Flynn. Alexandra is the Associate Professor at UBC Peter A. Allard School of Law, also Director of the Housing Research Collaborative, and has written extensively. And one topic that she's covered that I'm interested in hearing about is the Toronto waterfront plan and that interesting work. So anyways, I'll turn it over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. This is such an esteemed group of people to be talking about the really cementing the role of municipalities in housing beyond the way that we've done it in Canada. Just looking at the list of people who are here, I don't think I have to say very much about why cities matter when it comes to housing, when it comes to many issues. And I'm going to just, in the time that I have, talk about city deals in two main contexts. So the first is city deals from a legal perspective, what some of the thoughts I had from Duncan's piece were. And second of all, a few thoughts when it comes to designing them. So first, understanding city deals from a legal perspective. So Canada has no real housing framework, no real legal framework that guides housing, and it's part of what has led to so many of the challenges that we have from the housing perspective. But what we do have is something called the National Housing Strategy Act, which is a piece of federal legislation that identifies and establishes that housing is a fundamental human right. And this act also requires the federal government to have a strategy. And although it's non-justiciable, nobody can go to court and say that the federal government isn't doing what it's supposed to do, at least not yet. I know some of the people in this room are thinking about that question. What it does is provides a clear legislative mandate for the federal role in housing. And more than that, it establishes that there must be meaningful engagement with affected communities, and it encourages the government to focus on systemic barriers. So this act is really the normative grounding for the federal government to be thinking about how to do housing well and how to be doing it with communities. Secondly, although we don't have in Canada the housing identified in our constitution, we do have within our federal architecture something called the federal spending power. And what that does is it identifies that the federal government can give money to parties, to governments, and it required that funding correspond with particular obligations. And this has been found to be constitutional. And this is, again, one of the groundings that we have to identify that city deals fit within our constitutional framework. In fact, city deals offer a flexible intergovernmental tool in a way that we need given the lack of direction in our constitution around housing. The federal spending power is something that has been tested in court, and it's something that can be used to identify that this kind of relationship between the federal government and local governments and other parties, perhaps, is something that is solid and, in fact, can provide the backbone to realize the National Housing Strategy Act. And then from a legal perspective, I want to end with another point that is incredibly important, I think, which is the question of what local encompasses. So in the papers that were provided, we talked a lot, obviously, about municipalities and about the broader thinking around what we mean by that. Could it mean regional governments, which I think it can? Can it mean other kind of interested parties, which I think it can? But it also has to consider First Nations and Indigenous communities, many of whom who are now reaching the point of capacity where they are designing their own housing systems, in some cases, like my own city, the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. First Nations are, in fact, leading affordable housing for the general public. And so in thinking about city deals, we need to consider the role of First Nations and Indigenous people. Okay, so that's part one, the sort of legal framework and why it matters. Secondly, I want to talk just briefly about how. What are some of the things we want to keep in mind? So I want to just start this by saying we do this already. We have already done city deals. We just haven't really called them that. And we've had them from a variety of perspectives. So I'm going to call these a kind of like pilot model, but we have the Housing Accelerator Fund, we have the Rapid Housing Initiative, we have the Federal Lands Initiative, we have all sorts of agreements that have been made that implicate federal and municipal governments already. And we can think of these as being early stage prototypes in considering the legal feasibility and governance frameworks that we need for city deals. We also have more structured, system-oriented models like what was once the Federal Gas Tax Fund, infrastructure funding, where we have even deeper and more considered models, especially in places like Ontario, where we fleshed out in a bit more detail how to actually do these deals in a way that delivers federal funding to the local level. And in another wicked problem area, health, we have what's at the other end of the spectrum. We have a mature model of cooperative federalism that grapples with a wicked problem area that's not enshrined in the Constitution. And this shows what a fully embedded long-term intergovernmental framework can look like. So a couple of suggestions for design. Number one, we need to start with pilots. Duncan mentioned this in his papers, and I want to just offer a few additional thoughts related to this. We need to test new government arrangements with pilot studies where we're identifying legal friction points early, gaps that we have in authority, perhaps consultation obligations that we haven't thought through, regulatory misalignments. We want to demonstrate essentially a proof of concept that builds the political and institutional confidence that we need to scale up. And we need to do so in a way that makes sure that there's multi-year funding certainty, which is one of the biggest impediments for municipalities when they're dealing with housing crises, that we have a clear sense of what's going to happen because of delays, which are probably going to happen, political turnover, which is almost for sure going to happen, reallocation when it needs to happen, and then, of course, as we've seen play out more recently, remedies where a party is not performing. And most importantly, we need to embed the National Housing Strategy Act in these pilot studies from the get-go, the human rights principles that are enshrined there. And I want to conclude by saying that another essential element that we need to have are strong definitions and data governance rules embedded in these pilot studies so that we can get them right. Canada still needs to have better, more consistent and coherent definitions across the board on what we mean by terms like affordability, what we mean by affordable housing. Moreover, we need to be using the right data. We need to be using consistent data. And we have this out there, for example, with HART's Housing Need Assessment Tool. We need to be embedding solid, consistent nationwide data tools from the get-go. So in conclusion, there's no question that city deals respond to a structural challenge in Canadian federalism. And these well-crafted agreements can provide the legal certainty and the coordination that we need to actually realize the right to housing in Canada.
That's much appreciated, Alexandra. So we will now turn to Neil Bradford, and just to introduce Neil, he's professor and chair at the Department of Political Science at Huron University College, which is affiliated with Western University, and deals with a number of topics and over his many years of research and writing. And certainly city deals is something that I personally have had an opportunity to learn from him. So with that, without further ado, we'll just turn the floor over to Neil. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. In my brief remarks, I'm going to provide a little bit wider context for the city deal discussion in terms of some of the work that's been ongoing at the OECD, and also a couple of historical examples, ongoing examples actually from Canada, where we've seen this kind of multi-level collaboration in practice. So my first observation would be that the OECD's Territorial Development Policy Committee has been working with ideas about collaborative governance over the past, nearly 3 decades, 30 years. And they've really demonstrated, I think, through their research and through their applied policy activity, that spatially tailored sectoral policies such as housing that apply across a country require adaptation to the specific needs and assets of different geographic communities, from the metropolitan centers to rural and remote regions. And such place-based approaches are now an essential part of the governance toolkit across the OECD world, with their effectiveness resting on 4 key principles of practice. First, localization, that national or federal interventions are based on fine-grained understanding of local context, as articulated by place-based coalitions of local representatives, often spanning administrative and municipal boundaries. Second, integration, a systems thinking approach for policy coherence that captures spillovers and synergies across jurisdictions and sectors, making connections with wider environmental, economic, and social outcomes, and also empowering an institutional mechanism such as the proposed city deal to do the joining up. Thirdly, collaboration, multi-level governance for vertical and horizontal coordination using contracts to structure relationships, including funding conditionalities and shared results accountability. And then fourthly, as Alex was emphasizing, learning, an experimental approach using pilots to test and monitor new governance models, clarifying what works where and why, and forging a community of good practice. From the perspective of someone who's been studying Canada's comparatively limited place-based collaborative governance policy for decades, what Duncan and his team is bringing forward is really quite promising breakthrough. Acknowledging, though, our limited track record, I do think there are 2 significant Canadian policy legacies that are relevant to today's discussion, and I would just like to share some of the highlights of these initiatives. There are 2 notable place-based policy efforts at different spatial scales or geographic settings. At the big city metropolitan level, we have had urban development agreements bringing together multiple players, federal, provincial, municipal, community, and the private sector, with a 30-year run from 1980 to 2010 in Winnipeg and Vancouver. And there have been several notable common features of these UDAs. They emerged in times of crisis, maybe not the poly-crisis moment that we're experiencing now, but in recognition of significant localized problems. The federal government played a catalyst role in these agreements through the regional development agencies. A tri-level secretariat was created for shared governance, and 5-year contracts were signed with renewals. There were certain distinctive elements. In Vancouver, it was essentially an unfunded agreement with strategic planning tables created for a particular distressed neighborhood, generating a menu of collaborative projects that then secured tri-level funding through 2 agreements over 10 years. In the Winnipeg context, significant aligned federal, provincial, and municipal investment, over 4 agreements, about $100 million per agreement, levering matched private sector investment, And in Winnipeg, the development agreements created long-term spin-offs and two urban development corporations. And the agreements covered various scales from the neighborhood to city region and with evolving priorities over 30 years. Some of the shared takeaways from these urban development agreements: the federal lead around local priorities, the full participation of the provinces, political champions, ministers and mayors, the importance of ongoing community input, and really nurturing a collaborative tri-level tradition that in the Winnipeg case survived multiple electoral changes and rooted in trust relations, tapping into evolving priorities over time, and evaluation both by third-party professional organizations and communities as well. That's at the urban, metropolitan, big city scale where we've seen these kinds of collaborative multi-level efforts. I'd speak to a second example in the more rural and regional or remote parts of Canada where we have community future development corporations. They speak to some of the capacity gaps that Duncan identified in the paper outside the metropolitan centers for this kind of collaborative work. The CFDCs date back to 1985. There are 267 of them across all Canadian regions, with multi-sector boards embedded in local communities and economies. The focus is on strategic economic development and business priorities, but increasingly these have been including infrastructure investments around affordable housing supply through financing and planning, partnering with developers, municipalities, and provinces. The CFDCs then have a long-standing, ongoing community base of expertise. They're a respective collaborative governance mechanism to potentially coordinate and align with as we think about city deals beyond the metropolitan centers. So by way of conclusion, I would simply say that that the proposed CHICs really do offer the potential to align different interventions and funding streams in both big cities and smaller communities, and provide really a kind of opportunity for a first mover place-based example relevant to other complex policy fields like in the environment or public health. And in so doing, are filling potentially an evident gap in our federalism that has relied historically on bilateral federal-provincial agreements, or increasingly, as we've seen, federal, municipal, local direct agreements, but not including the provinces. So this type of bottom-up, tri-level arrangement, we've had experience in earlier periods, and there's a legacy to draw on. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much for that, Neil. And so I think we're probably about 5 minutes behind, but notwithstanding that, Duncan and Jim, you were going to weigh in on what you've heard so far, and then we're going to engage our city participants in their thoughts and insights to what's been said so far. So with that, Jim and Duncan, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Jim?
No, you go ahead, Duncan.
I don't have anything much for once to say. Both contributions are really fantastic. Alexander, you really spelled out where this could fit without undue difficulty within constitutional and other arrangements. And Neil, I think pointing out that there are many of these entities operating in a relatively isolated fashion, plus there is a heritage from the past, is really important to put back on the table. I mean, one of the reactions I've had when I've spoken to people in government about this, and not necessarily our sponsors in housing, infrastructure and communities, is, oh, this is too difficult. Provinces will not like this. And I point out that the two biggest users of the city deal arrangement in the UK in terms of intensity of support from the subnational levels of government have actually been Scotland and Northern Ireland, both of which, if you like, and Scotland particularly has the structure and financing of a province, but it's also been governed for 17 years by a political party that actually wants to leave the UK, as does the administration in Northern Ireland presently wants to leave the UK. So the notion that political difficulty on a whole set of unrelated political issues stops this happening, I think, is kind of not really genuine. And there is a real strong case for looking, as you say, about integrating what has been there and actually developing a number of prototypes that can be used in this system. So thanks. I learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you, both Neil and Alex. That was outstanding. And I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is that these are really, really great insights on being able to blow out this idea of a CHIC model. And I guess the one of the biggest challenges I think, might be just in the inception of these and getting all of the political buy-in that's necessary. My suspicion is that, there's certain political postures that benefit from being, always on the outside and naysaying. And well, if you can get those political postures into the room and into the agreement, then it silences those. But the silencing might be contrary to their political aspirations and their political tactics, right? It kind of clips their wings a bit, if you like. And so, in other words, while on the one hand, some provinces have complained that the federal government has gone direct to municipalities, on the other hand, that might actually be beneficial to them from a political standpoint. They can, continue to say like, oh, the federal government isn't doing enough for us or isn't acting properly. So I think that will be a challenge. But I think on the other hand, given the scope of the Build Canada Homes vision, which is, and the most popular part of it that's been publicized has been the modular homes, but it also says, we're going to grow the non-market sector and we're going to sort out what we desperately need to with respect to housing supports. That's going to require a cross-sectoral, multi-level approach. And frankly, it's going to include a whole host of things that are under provincial jurisdiction related to supports, including income security. And in addition to that, it will require a kind of local approach to understand what exists in terms of the non-market sector capacity. And what we found in our research was actually the HAF was stimulating of that capacity in a lot of instances. Like the capacity was built to take advantage of the HAF. And so that capacity does need to be built. So anyways, just a couple of thoughts and then pass it back to Chris so that we can carry on with the rest of our remarks.
Well, again, much appreciated. So as Jim points out, we are now going to turn to some of the municipal experts, as pointed out earlier, the ground up people, so to speak, that are living the housing reality every day. And with that, I think what we're interested in is how, based on what you've heard so far, how does it resonate with your experiences? And so we're going to begin the City of Edmonton. Crystal Jenner, who is the director of Housing Action Team, and which is dealing with everything from homelessness to affordable housing, so a wide spectrum of the housing continuum. So with that, Crystal, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to CHEC for having me here. I always feel like I learn so much from participating in CHEC events, and I'm great. Hopefully everyone else in the audience will feel the same after I'm done talking. I'm also grateful to be here with my colleagues, my esteemed municipal colleagues, Abby and Dan, who I feel like I've been having these conversations with for quite some time. And so really grateful to have the opportunity to continue that. I also wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm coming from Edmonton, the city of Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 territory and home to the Nehiwa, Dene, Anishinaabe, Nakota Iska, Blackfoot peoples, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis and a significant population of Inuit peoples. Anytime we're talking about housing, I think it's really important to acknowledge the role that Indigenous peoples need to play in the conversations around the solutions when it comes to making sure that everybody has a house within their home. I also wanted just to maybe start by just explaining a little bit about my work and who I am, and then I'll get into some reflections on what we've heard so far. So as mentioned, I'm the director of the city's Housing Action Team. I've been doing that for the last just over 2 years. And the Housing Act, and prior to that, I was the director of affordable housing and homelessness for the city of Edmonton for about 6 or 7 years. So I've been working at a municipal level in the housing space for a little while. The unique piece about the Housing Action Team is it was actually created in no small part as a reaction to the Housing Accelerator Fund and the need that we saw municipally to start integrating everything the city does related to housing into a more comprehensive approach. We used to always talk about how Edmonton is a tale of two cities. So, it's relatively affordable when it comes to those barriers for homeownership or new entrants to homeownership, but it has significant housing need. It has the third largest share of core housing need in the country after only Toronto and Vancouver. And it also is dealing with a significant challenges related to homelessness, which is at its all-time high right now in Edmonton. And so I think having this encouragement to bring together a systemic approach has really helped us to sort of understand how the different components of the system, as described in a lot of these papers, really work is felt at the municipal level. And given this language, I think, to talk about that, I really like the framing of the poly crisis in your paper, Duncan, talking about rental burden, homelessness, and barriers to entry, because maybe in Edmonton, the barriers to entry on homeownership haven't been as bad, but we are very acutely feeling the other two issues. And I think just having some common language to explain our regional variation is really appreciated. I'll just quickly talk about our Housing Accelerator Fund action plan, because I think Housing Accelerator Fund does serve as a good proof of concept for a future city deal or something, or municipal deal, whatever we want to call it, housing and infrastructure deal. So in Edmonton, we have an action plan. We've put our 195 million that we received from the federal government into a 13 plank action plan, which includes a number of measures. Things were a little unique for us because in Edmonton, we had been working to systematically dismantle barriers to housing supply for well over a decade prior to the Housing Accelerator Fund's launch. And so when we were coming up with our action plan, we had to dig sort of deep and come up with some novel actions that we thought could really incentivize what we wanted to see, because a lot of the sort of the best practices we'd already implemented. So some of the lower hanging fruit were gone. So I'll just talk about a few of the main initiatives. One of them is we are currently in the process of developing 10 surplus school sites into almost 1,400 units of mixed income housing. Over 900 of those will be affordable units as well. We also have created something called an infill infrastructure fund, which was developed in response to engagement with the private sector when we were looking at basically asking the question of how do we put greenfield development or development in developing areas on the same playing field as redevelopment, and in redeveloping areas, how do we make infill and greenfield, similarly scalable and easy. And so it's a cost sharing mechanism for offsite infrastructure costs associated with large increases in density and new redevelopments. So it's eligible for any projects near high speed transit are eligible over 10 units, and it'll pay up to $4 million in terms of offsetting the offsite improvement costs of infrastructure related to significant increases in density. So sometimes we were seeing there's a lot of really good development sites that weren't going ahead because there was no mechanism of sharing the infrastructure burden amongst adjacent parcels. And so this is providing a way of offsetting that burden so that some of these developments can go ahead, and then that'll in turn unlock development in adjacent parcels. We have a lot of other initiatives. I won't get into it. You can look at our website at Google City of Edmonton Housing Accelerator Fund. But one of the things, just to talk about the comments, I do think the Housing Accelerator Fund, our experience in Edmonton has been positive. We're achieving our targets. We're ahead of schedule that way. It's unlocked a lot of affordable housing. And so I think from my perspective, it certainly is a good proof of concept for what a future deal could look like. Some of the positives of it that have been mentioned, but I think are, the combination of flexibility. So as a municipality, it was up to us to come up with initiatives to achieve targets. So the combination of the flexibility with the targets, I think, is really key. And then the contractual obligation, I think, was important too, because it takes in government, we have a natural tendency towards risk mitigation, and having a contractual agreement in place kind of flips the logic on its head, where we had to take some more aggressive initiatives to make sure we meet our contractual obligations and mitigate the risk associated with defaulting on those contracts. So I think the combination of those elements in the plan were really good. I also think that the incentivization piece was important. I don't think it was like a one-to-one in terms of the resources we achieved were not necessarily enough to assure the outcomes on their own, but they definitely encouraged us to think really creatively in how we can most efficiently achieve the outcomes with the resources that were provided. I also liked the combination of the target with systemic changes that was evaluated in our action plan. So we couldn't just have we're going to give everybody some money and just everybody build more housing, because if it wasn't seen as systemic enough of a change and in terms of delivering additional housing units beyond the life of the agreement, then it may not have been accepted. And I think that's really important because it's led to some important changes internally at the city about how we work and how we integrate different aspects of the housing system, whether it's the people who deal with homelessness or the planners. I think that was really important. It also required us, I think the local leadership was important because it meant that we really engaged a lot of other people in the conversations about how to achieve these targets. So regardless of the action plan number, we did a considerable engagement. Some initiatives we talked to, in the example, the surplus school sites, we were figuring out how to make that go. We did market sounding with over 25 different builders and agencies. We also created an affordable housing development guide as part of our affordable housing sector capacity building initiative with HAF. And we talked to 125 different agencies about what do you need to know, what are your questions? And so I think having that kind of engagement and bringing in different segments of society beyond just government was enabled by HAF. One of the main detractors, I'll just say, like in terms of things to work on going forward, obviously it's been mentioned, but the provinces weren't part of HAF. I firmly believe, after all the time that I've been working in housing, that we will not really move the needle on any of these things unless all three orders of government are working together. So that's why I'm really grateful to be here. And I will say, although our province wasn't involved in HAF, I don't think the barrier was political so much as procedural in terms of the timing and the way that it was announced. Because, when we just announced our surplus school sites last week, we had the minister from the province at that announcement with our mayor. I think we have a lot of alignment with the province on affordable housing and housing outcomes. And I think that that's something that could be adjusted going forward, especially, when there's money involved. I think that gets everybody to pay attention and to talk. And so I think it's worth it for all, even if sometimes it can be more convenient to have a conversation with only one other person than two, but it's definitely worth it to have all three together. And actually in Alberta, we're continuing that along those lines. Even today, we're talking with all three orders of government about how do we create like a one window portal for affordable housing outcomes as an example. And I think we need to keep building on those types of initiatives, notwithstanding the politics. I think behind the scenes, there's always a lot more conversations happening than might be easily apparent. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention about the regional piece too, because it talked about, Duncan, you talked about that as being a characteristic of an effective agreement. And I think that's the one where I feel like we'd be a little bit challenged in Edmonton and probably the prairies, where regional government in general has less salience. We had a metropolitan regional board in Edmonton that was actually just dissolved last year. And it did deliver some really good outcomes in terms of density targets and things that led to a relatively compact form in our new neighborhoods. And, as a result, Edmonton's one of the few cities across Canada that's densified over the last 5 decades. But at this time, we don't have an effective regional governance structure. And I think there's a lot of transaction costs that can be incurred when you're trying to, and I may be doing this on another program right now, trying to talk to other regional municipalities, even if there's buy-in. Just the scale is usually the center has much more to gain. So it's kind of I think you really need an effective regional. It's hard to do it one-to-one with a bunch, even if you have a coalition of the willing. So, and then the last thing I'll say is regionally, traditionally, at least in Alberta, I'm not sure about other places, but Indigenous governments haven't been included in regional governance structures. And I think that's a miss, especially when we're talking about housing. And so I think if we're looking at city deals that are spatial and place-based, we also need to consider the role of Indigenous governments in those conversations and those plans.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Crystal, for that. And we're going to turn now to Vancouver and Dan Garrison, who's the Assistant Director of Planning and Head of Housing Policy and Regulation. So, Dan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to everyone who's spoken so far. It's really, really interesting. I'll start similarly with Crystal, just recognizing that I'm on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I'm coming from today. And that's, I think, really important in the Vancouver context, because here in the Metro Vancouver region, First Nations governments are really driving actually innovation and on housing change. And it's great that Abby's here too in her new role, and maybe we'll speak a bit about that. On my way into work today, I was listening to the CBC and I heard Justin McElroy, our local government reporter here in Vancouver, describe our national governance relationship as the federal government has all the money, the provincial governments have all the power, and municipal governments have all the problems. And that kind of rung true to me. So I think I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think it's a really important one. In Vancouver, we've been sort of dealing with what I think we'll all call the housing crisis, and I'll agree with Crystal that I like the framing of a poly crisis because it really is hitting all aspects of our housing system, of our economy in Vancouver. I think in Vancouver, that notion of a housing crisis probably hit us a little bit sooner than it did in the rest of Canada. We've been dealing with this a bit longer. Some would argue we've been dealing with it for 50 years. But I would say probably coming out of the financial crisis in 2008-9, things really got out of hand in terms of just a complete disconnect between housing cost and incomes generated in the local economy, homelessness, like all the issues that we're now facing. And so I think from our perspective, the federal government and provincial governments returning to the housing world, both here happily in British Columbia in around 2017, around the same time that the federal government introduced the national housing strategy, the provincial government reintroduced their strategy and launched a suite of new programs. And we're really pleased that both levels of senior levels of government have gotten back into the game. I think the point we would make is that it's great that they're returning after taking a couple of decades off, but they should understand that they're returning into a municipal system that's vastly different than the one that they left in 1993. Municipal governments have been the ones that have been innovating in Canada on housing in the absence of federal and provincial participation over that period of time. We've created whole new approaches to delivery, new ways of trying to raise what little capital we can and deploy it, new planning regimes and regulatory measures to support the delivery of affordable housing. And all that's been good. We've tested the limits of doing this on our own, though, and found that we simply can't do it. It does, as Crystal said, need all three levels of government. And in terms of the reintroduction, I never thought I would find myself having the opportunity to agree so strongly with the Toronto Board of Trade. But when I read the reports that Duncan sent, the thing that jumped out most clearly for me was that quote from the Toronto Board of Trade: federal resources earmarked for urban challenges are invested through top-down programs, which must be applied for and approved on a project-by-project basis. This approach creates a system which prioritizes busy work such as announcements and processes over deliverables and capacity management. I think that I agreed with that probably the most strongly of anything I've seen here. So the promise, I think, of the kind of, city deals or collaborative structures that we're talking about creating, I think, the city of Vancouver would certainly welcome those kinds of approaches that could allow us to take the kinds of innovations we've been working on and trying to deliver at the local level that have been running into barriers, things like portfolio approaches to the delivery and financing of housing. It's been impossible to move those forward, frankly. And so the idea that we would be able to have structures that would involve all three levels of government, potentially others, private sector involvement, regional governments, in that work, to set priorities, to figure out what local context is and how you could best deliver in those contexts would be hugely beneficial. I do think there's questions about structure and function that come up, like how do we get from here to there? The point in British Columbia, I think you would absolutely need to involve the province of British Columbia. We are, there will be grumbling at various places in British Columbia about BC housing, but I think when you take a step back and you look at the cross-country jurisdictional landscape, we are very fortunate in British Columbia to have such a high capacity, focused provincial agency delivering the things they do, and I think it would be a detrimental to not engage them in a process like this. I do think they have such a critical role. And a point related to that is not only in the delivery of housing, but in the delivery of the infrastructure that's needed to support the growth and the housing development. There's been a sort of related point. There's been a lot made recently of municipal development charges and hindrances and barriers those make to or may sort of the headwinds they create for housing development. And I think those are fair arguments. I've made many of those same arguments myself over the last number of years. But the reality is we haven't really had many alternatives. There haven't been options for how municipalities are going to deliver infrastructure other than through development charges. So we've been calling in Vancouver for quite a long time now for a rethinking of municipal finance structures, of how infrastructure gets delivered, of how that infrastructure is linked up to the notion of housing delivery, so that we can address these sort of wicked problems together. A couple of just points on examples. I mean, for us, we took our housing functions a few years back and moved them into the planning department for a couple of reasons, and that's now my role is mostly strategic, guiding the growth, identifying the housing we need, where it goes. The work with both planning on where housing goes and with our engineering department on where the infrastructure goes to support it is absolutely critical. I think we were able to bring some of that forward through the Housing Accelerator Fund process. So I think that was good to have the level of flexibility in that program that existed. I'll give one other example, which was federal and provincial governments and regional governments invested in the Broadway subway project recently. A massive, like multi-billion-dollar investment in subway infrastructure. When they did that, they created something called the SPA, it might be a very Vancouver name. It's the Supportive Policies Agreement, and there was a SPA construct where we had to get together with all the partners involved on a regular ongoing basis. There was formal legal agreements around how we were monitoring. We had to hit timelines on delivering the land use planning that went along with the infrastructure investments. We had targets around how much housing we had to deliver in response to the federal and provincial infrastructure investments. And it's worked out well. A couple of years later, we have 25,000 new housing units in the pipeline in relation to the Broadway subway project. 20,000 of that is rental. Over 4,000 of it is deeply secured below market rental. And from what was important to us was very, very progressive policies and practices to protect existing renters in the areas. So the subway investment didn't result in displacement of the very people who needed the subway. So just as an example, I think there are ways that this can work. I think it would be very important for us all to work together. I really appreciate the discussion that's being had today and the high quality of the folks on the panel. And I'll leave it there and look forward to what Abby has to add. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for that, Dan. You mentioned a couple of things, but the one that struck me was this notion of a portfolio approach. And I do think the federal government, at least the senior administrators I've worked with there, are saying or talking more and more about that approach. And you can imagine, I mean, I'm obviously more from Ontario than I am from the rest of the country. You know, they recognize dealing with 444 municipality and their housing needs in a one-on-one fashion is not going to work. So, so I do think there might be an opportunity to engage the federal government in that conversation, obviously with support from the provincial government. So, with that, we're going to turn now to Lee Bursey, a Canadian activist, journalist, musician, author, and as I understand, a former municipal politician. So who's got considerable experience in housing in a number of realms. So with that, very interested in what you have to say as well, Lee. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chris. My name is Lee Bursey, pronouns he, him, his. I'm 38 years old. I live in New Brunswick, but I also have immense experience in the Ontario and Newfoundland jurisdictions. Understanding the different nuances of social and community housing, as well as the homelessness epidemic. And I've even worked in the private sector in terms of everything from flipping units and property maintenance right on through to a variety of other portfolios that exist within the entire ecosystem, a continuum. My most recent role was actually working with a service commission where I was a housing initiatives manager, meaning that I worked hand in hand with municipalities, multiple municipal partners, even just crafting and understanding the dialogue and necessitating the necessary conversations that needed to happen in order for the housing continuum to move forward, the pendulum to swing in the right direction. And it was not without its faults and not without its obstacles and challenges. I can say that there were a number of comments I heard some of the other panelists make here that I think are worth echoing. I appreciated the comment about how the federal government has the resource, the provincial government has a jurisdiction, and the municipality has the responsibility and is often, pigeonholed to the crisis. And I think that that's something that is important because only in the last number of years, in the last couple of years maybe, leading into, I guess, the most previous minority parliament and some of the challenges that we saw in terms of jurisdiction creep and some of the challenges that we saw in terms of, I guess, passing the buck in terms of those responsibilities. It's probably the only time that I can recall, at least on a national level, where we had provinces taking the federal government to court because something such as the Accelerator Fund was bypassing certain jurisdictions to be offered directly to municipalities, or that we had municipal governments saying that it's not our wheelhouse to be delivering housing, the federal government saying the same, and people often, many times, in these positions of authority, determining that something as crucial and community-based as a housing crisis is or is not within their wheelhouse. And I found that very interesting because realistically, Prime Minister Mark Carney can be a great guy. He doesn't know you. He very well may not care about you specifically and your plight or circumstance, but the people in his office will be designing the policy that's delivered, and they will be the ones who help shape what that continuum is going to look forward. All the more reason why municipalities need to be involved in this process, and all the more reason why we need to make sure that we're looking at this from, I don't want to use buzz terminologies like collaboration. I often hear about communication and collaboration at every one of these type of public exposés and panels and process and thought cafes, et cetera, et cetera. It always comes back to stronger collaboration among municipal, provincial, nonprofit, private sector, et cetera, et cetera. And I really have to ask, what does that mean? Right? We already know the issue exists, and we also know that we have three levels of government arguing over how it's not their responsibility to deliver the outcome. And how one believes that they're doing things efficiently, despite the fact that those numbers are not in place in many provinces. One saying that they've put the funding streams in place, but whether they are effectively being deciphered, regulated, and if it's creating that prosperity can sometimes be questionable. And of course, the municipality saying, "Well, we're cash strapped and we can't do more than we are." I think that when we look at things from that perspective, we realize how many times that buck has passed when realistically, I remember speaking at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario conference a number of years ago. And I remember the person who was moderating the session said, "You were about to participate in a conversation about what will easily be the most complex, overwhelming issue of your time." And I remember thinking to myself, thank you so much for this fantastic introduction. I know it's well-meaning. Now allow me to tell you why that is preposterous. What is so complex about four walls and a roof? What is so complex about something as basic and fundamental in our Canadian society? Wartime housing is something we used to hang our hat on. Our National Housing Acts were always very strong. We have named our greatest Canadian as someone who helped to deliver Medicare, while we have people who are dying just south of the border because of medical bills, children being born into debt. Meanwhile, we have ample space, some of the largest per capita square footage in the entire world, access to fresh lumber, access to water, access to food, access to you name it. We are a very prosperous, beautiful, self-sufficient, and incredible nation of people who are struggling sometimes, realistically, in near third world conditions in front of us, except in an ecosystem and economy that many times, I guess, trivializes those experiences. I'll never understand how we have, we have nurses during the pandemic who were sleeping in shelters, making decent income and working incredibly hard, and were dependent upon them, and it still wasn't enough. The idea that the private market will solve all and that this will magically sort itself out because the budget will balance itself is categorically not true. And we have seen how this doesn't necessarily come into play. We can also look at the fact that the average life cycle for a woman in shelter in Ontario is 36 years old would be a life cycle. 36 years old. I am 38. I have now outlived the life expectancy of a woman who lives in shelter in Ontario. That is preposterous. The number of people who I have lost, that I have loved, looked up to, supported, believed in, just since 2021, and coming from largely rural landscapes. So not Toronto, not feeder systems such as Edmonton, which we heard about, and Vancouver, and these giant astronomical spaces of need and complexity. But just in my own rural background, my own neighborhood, my own community, and the various communities that I've gotten to participate in, I've lost over 40 people either to self-harm, suicide, or overdose, many times directly related to their income and directly related to their inability to have basic fundamental needs met. I think that it's equally preposterous and foolish to think that we have governments of all levels arguing over whose responsibility it is to look out for the neighbors. I don't think that Joe Public cares one way or another as to who solves the problem. What they know is the problem exists and it's growing. And it's no longer not in my backyard. It's now in your basement. Your kids are moving home. Your seniors are moving in with their children, et cetera, et cetera. Grown adults who are finding themselves in cohabitated spaces that they would otherwise avoid, but maintain that they need to in order to just have those fundamental principles that many of us take for granted. I live in a 2,700 square foot home. I am very, very lucky. I at one point lived in a tent in my life. It can't happen. But I also live 45 minutes from the largest urban center. I spend astronomical levels on fuel, and I do so because I have a beautiful home and it's worth it for me at this time in my life. But it does not make it simple. Those economies of scale are sometimes very much out of reach for many people. And if I was to look at just some of the rural landscape data numbers that are here, we have more people who are exiting the workforce in my local economy than entering it. And we have more people in my age demographic who are unemployed than employed. So it's not as though it's that attainable. And furthermore, we have a dramatic level of 5-bedroom and 4-bedroom homes, despite the fact that, you know, the average nuclear family household does not look like it did in 1975, and it does not look like it did when a lot of our larger scale housing investment was made. Here in New Brunswick, only recently have we seen an investment in community housing since 1982. That's before my time. And that is way beyond the life cycle of a young woman who's living in shelter, as I mentioned. So I think there's a lot of variables to keep in mind. And I think that it's important to recognize that while it's great to say that this person's getting it right, this process is getting it right, this policy is getting it right, we know that that's not true. All I ever do is open up a Telegraph journal, which covers almost all of the large urban news within my entire province. And we will see that Accelerator Fund, for all of its modernization, which is the purpose of a housing accelerator, is to accelerate that infrastructure, accelerate those conversations and that policy development. We know that we have communities who are outwardly rejecting that money. And the reason why is because some of these policies are very prescriptive. For some people, for as of right is very complex, and it makes them wonder what's going to happen in their neighborhood and in their community, and they're disconnected from these issues. And while part of that frustrates me to no end, because realistically, a fourplex is not going to impact your property value, and is probably a remarkably important and good piece of infrastructure for your community, it's probably also fair to say that it's difficult for the municipality who has to field the concerns, field the frustrations, recognize and respond to those emerging needs and to those communities that are feeling that vitriol, that are expressing those very delicate, challenging obstacles, and then say to them, well, we access this remarkable investment, which is, many communities, a $12 million application becomes a $3.2 million response with the same level of workload as would have gone into the $12 million. And they're very, very clearly saying, and this is the expectation. And while that expectation may be fair in many cases, and for those sitting around this table with 100 of us here, no doubt for those of us who are here, we see the value in that investment. But to the community at large, who maybe is still changing with the times and still learning to adjust and hasn't visibly reached that crisis point, it can be very difficult to sell that narrative to someone else, especially when you have apathetic governments at all levels telling you how it's some other level of government's responsibility to tailor these messages, to deliver these policies. I think that it's important that we recognize that while there is remarkable value in an accelerator fund, and I look forward to hearing more and seeing more about the findings of these processes, I think that there's going to have to be an ample and equal study being done to the communities that are rejecting funding, rejecting multiple millions of dollars of very important housing infrastructure investment, simply because they're not able to properly capture and tailor why this is important to the populace that elects them. And I think that when we look just here in my neighborhood, someone who was working in the urban center, as someone who was dealing with community surrounding, we would see conversations about coupling of services and fragmenting and people ascending upon particular neighborhoods where services were strong, sometimes to the detriment of your local economy or detriment of your local community safety, which many times is debatable at best. But at the same time, while people think this is an urban issue and the idea that people will descend on these spaces, we are absolutely seeing the other end of that as well, which is here in some of the rural hamlets where investments are being made and houses are being built. You're still having people who are aggressively against this because they don't recognize that Uncle Joe or their brother Jim or themselves may need that because they have put their lives into these giant pieces of community infrastructure in their homes. We're seeing in Newfoundland people who have generations of homes that they have invested in, that they have poured their savings into, that they were told would be a good investment, are now selling their homes for $30 or $30,000 on Kijiji because they're 4.5 hours from the nearest emergency room and their health needs have changed. I think that sometimes people struggle to see exactly where they belong in this ecosystem. And I think that's because for some people, until you were confronted with the realities of one or two paychecks, or being short on a particular piece, or going through a death, a separation, a divorce, a circumstance, a life happening, it can be sometimes very difficult for us to realize just how gigantic the problem may be and how minuscule we may feel in that solution. So sometimes it's difficult to put ourselves in that space. And I think that this is the piece that needs to be kept in mind when we're looking at Build Canada Homes. And when we're looking at these various pieces of infrastructure investment and those divergences, you have to keep in mind that these policies, the community needs to feel as though they are part of shaping them and not merely prescribing them. The reason why is because ultimately you will have people who will reject the best ideas and the best of intentions regardless. But you're going to have more of that with people who continue to misunderstand process, misunderstand their place in that continuum, and continue to misunderstand whose role it ultimately is, which if, correct me if I'm wrong, it's all of our roles to help make our communities stronger and more tightly knit.
Well, if I can, Lee, if I can get you to wrap up, because you're bringing a lot of great points here, and I just want to be able to get to Abby and then questions from the group. So,
sure, absolutely. I'll do my best to just say that, aside from being very grateful for this opportunity, and I'm very engaged listening to all of these other wonderful speakers, I don't just come to you with complaints. The reality is what we've seen in many communities. We can go from south of the border, we can go from New York to Chicago and talk about how Housing First was actually very effective in some of these places. And we can see how, we have our 12 neighbors here in Fredericton area and these other communities where we're seeing these different inventive styles of service delivery attached to housing. There are paths forward and there are ways to do this effectively and ways to make this work. But none of that happens without the buy-in and investment of the community itself. And the idea that you would have those tailor-made, trailblazing municipal politicians being tasked with working with their local city planners and developers to deliver the messaging of higher up governments who are much more divested from this and much further away from it, I think is a problem. And I think you're going to continue to see those type of obstacles moving forward as long as people believe that they're being prescribed heavy-handed policy that they really had no say in helping to invent. So I think that there's work that all of us need to do in making sure that we are being the appropriate beacons of those incredibly important funds and investments, and making sure that we are vigilant of how these can be improved at any time.
Very much appreciate all of what you had to say, Lee. And as a fellow Frederictonian, I appreciate what you've been trying to do in New Brunswick. I know it's not easy. With that, I'm just going to ask Abby Bond to comment as well. Abby, I think many of us on this panel know her great work that she did in Vancouver. I got the pleasure to work with Abby directly in Toronto when she was the head of our housing secretariat, and has moved on to Toronto's loss, but the Squamish Nation's benefit to help them with their housing program. So with that, Abby, if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to Duncan for the research and the panelists for their great comments. So I'm also currently coming to you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and I work for the Squamish Nation. And this is a really important conversation for us to be a part of because really, like cities, a First Nation government is deeply rooted in the land. And this is really what we're talking about, is providing solutions and frameworks for governments to work in that are deeply connected to place. Behind me, hopefully you can see my background. You can see Sanark. This is our newest on-reserve housing development, probably one of the largest rental housing developments in Canada. You can see 3 towers there. We will be welcoming about 1,500 new households to Sanark in the spring of next year. And so the Squamish Nation is leading the way in terms of how to deliver housing at scale. So I think we really do relish the opportunity to have a different kind of conversation with government about how to do this, because we've certainly identified the ways to do it. And now we need a deeper and more meaningful conversation with both the province and the federal government as to how we can replicate this kind of approach and deliver for not just our Squamish Nation members, and also the community and the city at large. So we have this great opportunity. I think on reserve housing for us right now, we could probably in the next 10 to 20 years deliver sufficient housing on reserve to match the needs of about 40% of the North Shore municipal housing needs. So the opportunity is great. And we know what it takes. I think in the same way that this research talks about a different way of working, we've certainly been looking at that. So in recent times, to enable the nation to deliver its nation building goals, we've created 2 additional companies. So we have a for-profit company called Inchikai, which is the lead for Sanark development that you see behind me. And we also have HEAM, a nonprofit housing company, because in order for us to solve the problems of the future, we need to work differently. So we've already started walking down this path of different kinds of partnerships, different kinds of structures to deliver. We are also a recipient of the Housing Accelerator Fund. But I think there is a bigger opportunity through this research to take another step forward. I liked what Crystal said, that it's like we manage risk through contracts as government officials. That really kind of resonated with me. And that is one of the benefits of the Housing Accelerator Fund. It could also be the benefit of a city deal or a nation deal in our situation, is that we can frame the solutions in a way that we're comfortable to take risks together. For us, and I'll be brief here, I'll just say, the opportunity would be to come around some of the ways that we deliver infrastructure, the ways that we deliver housing, how we decide together with other levels of government how much financing is needed, where we get that financing from, how much grant money is needed, linking that to the level of affordabilities that our communities need. And finally, getting out of the program constraints that force us to only do one project at a time within one fiscal year, the opportunity, like city does, to work multi-year at a portfolio level. They sound simple, but actually the opportunity is to get into a conversation in order to develop a city or a nation deal is the 6 months that it would take you to talk through how that would actually show up. And that actually is one of the things that excites me the most, that we could actually really get into the discussion with the other levels of government and solve some of these big problems in a new way, and meet the needs of our residents. So I know we're short on time, so I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Abby. So with that now, Lindsay, I think there's likely some questions that are coming from the audience, and if you don't mind reading some of those questions, and we'll leave it open to our panel here to jump in and provide an answer. So go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, I'll bring the first question from the chat near the beginning of the discussion from Sanjam. Given that the Constitution of Canada does not even recognize the concept of municipal government and municipalities are the creations of provincial government acts, we saw what happened in Toronto where Ontario government unilaterally came in to reduce the size of council. Are we sure that federal spending power can work with the municipalities without running afoul of the provinces? Even the Housing Accelerator program under the previous federal government ruffled feathers with provincial governments expressing their displeasure at direct deals with municipalities and federal housing ministry.
So I don't want to pick on anyone, but Alexandra, if I can get you to maybe start and then others have comments. Go ahead.
Me too. Yeah, no, this is definitely a real issue. As we saw, the province of Quebec introduced legislation that expressly prohibited municipalities from having direct agreements with municipalities without provincial consent. Other provinces similarly voiced heavy concerns. So while there's nothing prohibiting the federal government on its face from engaging with municipalities, we've had court decisions that have said that there can be agreements between the federal government and other government that attach conditions as long as the federal government isn't legislating for those other governments, that's fine. In practice, it's obviously more complicated, and that's why the place-based nature of city deals is so essential. Every jurisdiction is going to have its own political realities, and those political realities are, at the end of the day, the ones that are, unfortunately, there's nothing robust enough to make it so without having to deal and without having to mess around in the political muck and figure out how to make these things work. But I would argue that that's exactly why city deals are so important, why we want to have much longer term, consistent, secure deals that are not just project by project, where the reality is that, infrastructure and housing are going to go well past the political lifespan of many leaders. We don't want to have to keep messing in the muck. We want things that are more reliable. That's exactly why these kinds of agreements are so essential. I'll stop there, and I'm sure everybody else has things to add.
That's great. Anyone else wish to weigh in, or we go to another question? All right, so I'm not seeing anyone light up on this. So Lindsay, next question, please. Lindsay, you might be muted.
I can take one. I've got one.
Okay.
Build Canada Home says it will prioritize proposals that feature strong partnerships. Wondering if the panel can speak to this and the portfolio approach in general that the BCH policy framework calls for. I think that's worthwhile. I think there's been a fair bit of agreement on the need for a portfolio approach. I guess I'd ask panelists to weigh in on whether we need more than just the housing unit delivery or whether we ought to be able to bring in more aspects of the poly crisis in. Maybe I'll ask Neil to tackle that one.
Yeah, well, this is where I think the strength of the old urban development agreements really stood out, that they were able to bring the three levels together, driven in part by a sense of crisis, either sort of localized problems in downtown communities and so forth, and draw out a wider conversation. And it really was quite pragmatic. It was driven by political leadership that then aligned the administrative and frontline resources for coordinated delivery. And it cut across from infrastructure to housing to neighborhood revitalization to issues around Indigenous services. It was really quite collaborative and built a sort of momentum out of the initial table. So yeah, I think that we do have in our history examples of where these wider intersecting issues have been quite strategically dealt with, even if we've kind of lost that sense of memory about how we put those together in a pragmatic way, which really parallels the city deal place-based approach that Duncan is drawing attention to across different jurisdictions.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Neil. And I mean, I would add in income security, I'd love to see into the mix as well, because housing affordability is at least partly an income problem. And we certainly lagged there. And that's obviously a very strong provincial responsibility. Again, it's often buttressed by the feds. So, and just thinking about that, actually bringing in the provinces, we've heard we've got representatives from BC here, and Crystal, I was delighted to hear that the Alberta government has been such a good partner. I might actually throw it back to Chris for a question on the Ontario context. What in your experience is the thing that is going to draw in Ontario into such an agreement? Because, I mean, for one reason or another, and I'm not sure of the exact reasons, Ontario has not been quite as much of a participant in the housing file, and the direct to federal to municipal has been very strong here.
Yeah, so certainly when I was city manager and then started working for the federal government, I can honestly say that the comments that I'm hearing from the senior administrators provincially, municipal affairs and housing in particular, you can see that they are evolving. What might have been a hard stance, a few years ago, I'm starting to see more and more senior officials attending meetings, whether it be civic action, other meetings with people that are trying to create this place-based approach. And so, to say that there's a formal program that would just, cause us all to be, much more optimistic. I mean, I'm not seeing that per se. But, I do think, and I think one of the challenges, and the Toronto Regional Board of Trade has hit on it. The municipalities in Southern Ontario, wake up every day, and what's on their agenda is enough to keep them busy 24 hours a day. So, as much as it makes a ton of sense to have city regions or a much more regional approach. It would be really helpful if the province did more to kind of expect municipalities to work together. Let's just put it that way. All due respect to my counterparts when I was at Toronto, it's hard getting people together and keeping them together to stay focused on a topic as important as housing. But I do think it'd be interesting to talk to senior officials municipally about this very topic that's in front of everyone right now, as to see what kind of appetite they might have in starting to kind of craft such an outline or a framework for a city deal that would involve, the Indigenous community, would involve more than just the city of Toronto, obviously, would involve the provincial government, and to, spend our time trying to craft what such an approach would look like with outcomes being specified. So I'm not optimistic for the sake of optimism. I do think, the crisis, as it's been communicated here and previously, it's not going away. We all know that the numbers are growing, and we need a different answer than what we've been doing before. And this idea that we can go it alone is absolutely impossible. So I think the timing of this work that everyone's doing here and the topics that we're talking about, I think are spot on. Now it's to, try to engage the local communities more in wanting to kind of work differently and kind of adhere to, what others around the world have done successfully. So maybe with that, I know we're just about at time. I'm going to just give it back to Duncan, yourself, and Jim, just to wrap things up, and then we can let everyone go on their way.
Thanks, Chris. Just continuing on that point and also answering Greg Sutter's question. I think that the strength of the deal framework was it got the geography right. I think that too many of the partnerships or whatever that have been designed, not just in Canada, but in many other places, still don't get to the intersection, at least at strategic levels, of labour markets, transport systems and housing systems. In other words, getting the strategic geography right. And as you said, beyond that, government can't deal with every single locality that has. So that geography point that comes out of these deals is really important. The time horizon point is important. And I have to say that having worked a lot in other countries, and actually having been in the National Housing Board in Scotland for 10 years, I still can't understand how non-profits and others, in partnership or not, are expected to deal with single one-off grants and cities dealing with single one-off grants rather than funded programs of work. It's a bizarre way of funding effective change, and also you fail to develop capacity. You know, when I talk to people about the non-profit sector here, and that's really important that it finds its right home in these city deals and communities too, as has been expressed. I'm always astonished that hardly anyone knows anything about the organisations, let alone even how many houses they have. Whereas in the UK and Australia, the monitoring system gives you a very clear insight to what these entities are, what they do, how they perform, but also what their strategic heft is. We don't have that. So we've been untidy in Canada, despite notwithstanding what Neil said, been a lot of good single experiments. The basic geography and history dimensions have not been as well done as they should have. I think Lee's made the point about how community has to be involved in this. Some city deals involved them really well, others didn't. And I think that would be important if one was developing models to make sure that was well looked after. Abby's making points, and so and others, that this isn't just a matter of redistribution, that we want to make sure that Indigenous interests are well looked after here, because the Indigenous interest is looking after wider bits of cities and their well-being, so that these groupings have to be thought of as important in the context where they really matter. So that geography, history, who's on this, but also the reasons. I think that a distinctive aspect of city deals was that they made spatial policy about growth issues as well as about disadvantage and redistribution and poorer neighbourhoods. It's a lot more than that. We've got to keep both on the agenda, but let's not forget the growth aspect. And I think that looking at the question of what entities, my point of what entities we create on the ground are really important in terms of how they then unfold. Like Dan's example of how Vancouver is doing its planning infrastructure and housing portfolio differently has a dynamic that you can see unfolding in very different ways from other places. We don't pay enough attention to that in the way, let's just get these organizations and get them delivering things. What they are, the networks they are, and how they think differently and how they create. This is about creative, innovative structures that we put rather than simply delivery structures. And I think that these are critically important. As for the issue about CHEC, in terms of what we do, I think we've learned a lot from today that would strengthen our argument. I think that the federal government should do this faster rather than slower. The half wasn't refunded in this budget, but it wasn't completely killed. Mm-hmm. So the interesting question is, instead of having half round two, should there be resource to put in place the basic mechanisms of city deals in a number of prototypes? In other words, government can work on this quite quickly and have proposals in place for a year from now in the budget. Well, less than a year from now. Why do I say this? Because in the UK, it went from discussion of the basic idea to the actual announcement of pilot projects in a period of 6 months. This is not rocket science. It's about taking decisions and also recognizing, because these are bespoke, they will all be different. It allows a bit of variability, and you have to fix some of the details afterwards. So I would, I've always wanted to be chic. So I would like to continue to think about these issues and push our results. I'm happy to talk to people in the audience today and more generally about how this might move forward. I also should just say thanks to everybody for their contributions. I thought that was really helpful. Thank you.
Great. And with that, I think we'll wrap things up. And thanks to the panel and participants. And I know we're a few minutes over, but it's a critically important topic that needs to get resolved. So anyways, with that, thanks to everyone.